I'm Brian Ganson. I am Senior Researcher with the Africa Center for Dispute Settlement at the University of Stellenbosch Business School. And I have a really easy job here today because I've got just a fantastic panel to share their experiences with the negotiation and implementation of a particular grievance process, but also their reflections putting that experience into context, into how does a grievance process fit into the larger issue of workplace relations. And when we look at workplace relations, particularly where we are now in the Western Cape, how do workplace relationships fit into the broader context of the social dialogue that needs to happen, and to some extent we all recognize isn't happening in the way it needs to happen. Let me briefly introduce our panel. First of all, joining us by video conference from Cape Town, we have Desmoline Minyi. Thank you, Desmoline, for stepping in. Desmoline, during the relevant period, was working with an organization called Women on Farms, so very much associated with the labor side. She is now with the Wine and Agricultural Ethical Trade Initiative. Bill Thompson is a senior commissioner with South Africa's Commission on Conciliation, Mediation, and Arbitration. He was the facilitator of the development of the grievance process and, to some extent, its implementation. Here with us in The Hague is Henny Claessens, who is the Market Access Manager for Kromco, works with growers packing the fruit, but also helping them achieve market access. And then finally, further to my left, Linda Lipperoni, who is the CEO of the Wine and Agriculture Ethical Trade Initiative. And I don't know the extent to which you're following our news as closely as we are in terms of labor unrest, social unrest that really seized the national consciousness in the mining sector. A few weeks ago, it was clear that we're also struggling with in the agricultural sector in the Western Cape. And so I think our discussion here today is layered in that way, trying to understand what happens when we try and implement something like a grievance process using a multi-stakeholder approach.
We do need mediation. I mean, and I don't think you need a lot. You need some credibility, and people are not going to speak to someone in their own management structure. They'd like to speak to someone out of it, and with the smaller farms being very, very flat structures, there's just not anybody in there that can make this work. So, I mean, even during the training, there was, and another Bill could remember this, we were 4 different companies, call it that, in the training, and people from my company wouldn't speak to me about anything. But I had people from 3 other companies coming to me. They didn't know me from a bar of soap. I could have been the biggest tyrant in the room, but I had perceived credibility, and they would raise anything with me, which was sometimes a bit scary. And the same thing happened to people from the other organizations. So that's how easy it is.
It just becomes clearer and clearer to me, and I can speak with the objective perspective of not only looking at the agricultural sector, but wherever I come across an imbalance in power relations between management and labor, for me that's just the absolute recipe for disaster and bullying and all kinds of things that can happen. And I really do, where I do see that trade union leaders, recognized shop stewards can meet in a meeting with their managers and their supervisors and be able to engage each other in a respectful, meaningful kind of way, that's where I see communication starting to happen effectively and where people can start to participate in the process. And I do think that there's a huge imbalance.
We believe that it would provide an opportunity, in fact, for all stakeholders, including government, labor, agribusiness, to start to agree on how you created the right environment, how you created an effective framework. And unfortunately, just in terms of participation, we didn't necessarily get that level of participation either from government or from, I believe, agribusiness in terms of leadership. And we talk about the frustrations which civil society and trade unions had in terms of engaging, in terms of trusting the process. Perhaps if we had far higher level people engaging in this process, we could have looked more broadly towards what the impacts would have been.
As the process unfolded, that the role became more and more of a holding parties together at times, and times having to have off-site meetings with different people to keep parties on the path for as long as possible. Parties need to be engaged on this particular mechanism, and they need to buy into this mechanism and need to feel that it's their mechanism.
When you start off with people, you need to continue with them and you need to end with them, because if you don't, again, you put the issue of mistrust back on the table. And if you want to start a new process, that is the very attitude that people are going to walk into the room with, possibly just another talk shop. And at the end of the day, workers are not benefiting in this kind of processes at all. And I think one of the key things that Linda said is that trade unions and civil society just do not have the capacity to come from one meeting to the other.
In the initial discussions that we had, there was an overarching expectation that perhaps instead of just focusing on farm level, we could look towards some kind of sectoral impact. And we see that happening now, where we've had labour protests and the inability to successfully negotiate with the powers that be. But in terms of creating some kind of structure that would actually have the legitimacy to be able to address those disputes, the focus shifted from what could have been quite a strategic multi-stakeholder initiative around developing the mechanism to what became a very local business case, which was really focused on mitigating risk at the farm level rather than looking towards empowerment and dialogue at the sectoral level, a business case that sought to improve the operating environment on the farm rather than develop really transparent and equitable frameworks for dialogue and shifting the power of balance. And essentially, I think the program sought to mitigate the broader protests against individual sites rather than to try and encourage mitigation of broader root causes of labour disputes and human rights issues.
I think what's happening in agriculture and what's happening in mining and what's happening throughout the sectors in South Africa at the moment has been something that the General Secretary of the Congress of South African Trade Unions, Zwelithini Zimbabwe, has referred to as a ticking time bomb. And someone mentioned once that to have normalized labor relations in an abnormal kind of society is very, very difficult. And I want to give encouragement to the parties who stayed the course in this grievance mechanism. I think it's a very good mechanism. I think it's doing all the right things. But I think one's got to see it in the context of what's happening in a broader situation in this country at the moment. South Africa has the very sad reputation as being the most unequal country in the world at the moment, from a poverty, inequality, and unemployment situation. In agriculture, we have a different situation where we don't have union leaders. We have very few, and we have a number of different trade unions. And in fact, we don't have that same kind of organization there. And as an independent mediator, I believe in trade unions, and I believe in strong trade union leadership and strong management. And part of this whole grievance mechanism that we discovered in our discussions was we can't put together a mechanism of this nature and leave it in isolation and leave it up to the parties to try and engage.